So this week I want to talk about co-occurring systems. And an example of a co-occurring system is kind of a team environment in combat. So over the years I was deployed, I was involved in a number of sort of combat situations. And when I'm in these situations, it's not really just about my performance to overcome the challenges on the battlefield. It is more about my performance plus how I interact with everyone around me, the resources that I have available from those individuals, from the equipment that I have, from the landscape that I'm within, how I access those resources and how I utilize them. So if I don't have access to information, okay, it's going to make it really difficult for me to understand what's going on and maneuver within that environment. If I don't have access to specific geographical features within that environment, it's going to make it really difficult for me to function properly. If I don't have access to the right equipment, then it's just going to make my job a lot more difficult than what it needs to be. And then within this co-occurring or codependent team system that we have, if I'm not able to function, then somebody else has to pick up that slack. So if I'm stuck down in a position I can't maneuver, then that compromises the team. And if we're trying to solve a much larger problem, then the team has to work to overcome the problem that's been created from my inability to perform. So within that now requires them to adapt to that change. So they have to change something. They have to change what they need to do. And they're working to solve this problem plus the problem that was presented in front of us. Adversely, if I'm performing really well and I have access to all the things that I need, good information, good geographical terrain that I need, all the equipment that I need, then I can perform at a really high level. And if I'm performing at a really high level, then I can add to other people's mental strength or resilience. I can provide some of my excess resources or improve their ability to function and reduce the pressure off them so that they can perform at their level that they need to. So it can increase the ability of those around me. So we often see this in not just combat environments, but a lot of other environments. So that leads me into what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about co-occurring systems, where resilience and mental strength is not just about us, it's about everything around us. So I spoke previously about thinking less about our resilience or our mental strength as our individual ability to withstand pressure or to sort of stay aligned under pressure with our path, and to think more about us being the centerpiece of this complex, dynamic, multi-dependent, biopsychosocial ecosystem in which it's not just about us, it's about us and everything within our environment. And that's either an environment where it's nurturing, allows us to grow really well, or kind of toxic, in which it's going to be the major contributor to our lack of resilience or mental strength or any negative emotions. So when we look at it as ourselves in this sort of co-occurring environment, there's a number of things that kind of are going to help improve our situation within this. So when we look at it, one of the big factors that's going to help us out is the resources that are within this environment and our access to those resources. So it's not just what's in there, it's our ability to access them. And we can sort of see that there's relationships that correlate between these factors, so resources and access, and our actual performance or our development. So some of the science shows that there's actually pretty good relationships between family household income and childhood or youth development in brain areas, or cognitive development in areas such as executive function, memory, and language. And that there's an inverse relationship between sort of reduced income within these households and increases in sort of aggressive behavior, antisocial behavior, and a lot of these suboptimal behaviors that you see in teenagers. So within these households, it's not just the financial complications or the reduced finances, it's what those finances or that income allow access to. So somebody who's in a house where they're in a really good financial situation, they have access to better resources. There's less barriers to them accessing the resources they need to allow that optimal cognitive development. In a house where there's sort of reduced income or reduced finances, there's more barriers, because finances, unfortunately, are a barrier to accessing some of these things. And it's not just the finances, it's some of the behaviors that go on within these households as well. So a lot around the routines that allow the optimal recovery, the optimal environment, the optimal setting where a child that's in the development areas can sort of be codependent on the factors within it to allow them to grow, or whether that environment is creating the stress that is creating the adaptation for that young child to adapt within that environment, and that leads to these suboptimal behaviors later on in life. So these things aren't just isolated to a household. We see these play out in sort of team sports. We see them play out in areas where you have executive teams, where you have teams working in organisations. And we see it play out a lot in the military, and specifically for myself, I've seen it play out a lot in combat. So when we're in these environments, our ability to perform is codependent on everyone else within that environment. So if an individual within these environments starts to perform at a suboptimal level, or they experience enough pressure that causes them to disrupt from their path or experience perturbation, disruption from their path, then that change creates the need for everyone within that group to change. So everyone within that group needs to be able to identify that change, they need to be able to adapt to it, and then they need to be able to change or to allocate the resources to that person to increase their capacity so that they can maintain their path. Because if one person starts to change or perform suboptimally, then the whole team can be compromised. So the whole performance can be compromised. So it's not just in negative aspects that we need to look at, it can also be a positive as well. So if one person or an individual within that team starts to performing at their highest level or at their peak, they can create space and reduce the pressure on other performers. So the other performers within that environment can then have the space and the reduction in pressure that they need to perform at their peak, and we can see this team either start to perform really well, perform at a sort of an average level, or it can start to underperform based around individuals and how they create that change within that sort of codependent team environment. And it's not only just isolated to performance as well, so it also goes into post-disruption as well. So when we see one individual perform really well in this area, we see everyone perform really well in this area. And inversely, when we see one or two members of a team perform poorly, then the whole team can be disrupted. So this goes into areas that allow sort of increases in recovery, it increases the resistance to future problem, it increases the ability for adaptation or how they adapt from these things and what they learn and how they go on and how they sort of move forward, and that sort of transformation of that team into being able to do more and cope at a higher level the next time that they experience pressure or experience this challenging or adverse environment. And the last thing that we need to consider within these sort of co-occurring environments or within these team environments is the impact of change. So when we introduce a strategy or we introduce something to change, we need to understand that it may increase what we think is resilience, or we may believe it's going to increase resilience in a specific area, but there's always going to be or likely to be unintended consequence or an unintended change from introducing that strategy or that intervention. And this can be sort of subordinate or superordinate, so it can sort of go up or down these sort of hierarchical codependent systems that we're in, so that when we introduce a change, something that is codependent or correlates to that specific attribute or that specific system is going to change. So when we look at this within the household income environment, if we just increase the finance or we just sort of throw money at that problem, it's not necessarily going to change. We will resolve the issue about financial barriers about gaining access to these resources, but they may access resources that are going to create further complications. So we don't necessarily know what's going to happen when we try and introduce a strategy. Same as when we introduce a strategy for our individual resilience or what we believe is our individual resilience, there's going to be a change based on that, and that change is going to impact everything around us to some point, and we just don't know whether it's going to be positive, whether it's going to be negative, or whether it's going to be indifferent. We just need to be aware that when we introduce a change to a system, everything that is codependent on that is going to have to experience that change. Something within that environment is going to change somewhat, so we need to be aware of that. And we see this play out a lot within our sort of community when we introduce short-term change to treat a symptom. Okay, usually there's a longer term change, or it has a longer term impact around something else, and like I said, we don't know whether that's going to be good, bad, indifferent. We just need to be aware it's going to happen. So once we can start to understand how our environment or how we interact within our environment, what is codependent, what we rely on, what's good, what's bad, what we need to change, we can start to look for the changes that we need to make, start to understand what or prepare for what potential changes may occur as a result of that change, and be prepared to sort of test and adjust as we go. And it's a continual process where we introduce a change, we see what happens, we adapt from that. So I hope that helps you understand a little bit more about how we're within a co-occurring environment in which that it's not just us, it's about everything that we have access to, or all the resources that we have within our environment and our access to them, and how we sort of are codependent within that. So once you can sort of identify these, then you can start to make the changes that you need so that you can get the outcomes that you want to sort of live the life that you're after. So I hope that kind of helps. Something to definitely think about, or get you thinking a little bit differently, so you can start to see the world a little bit differently as well. So I look forward to next time.